Hello, my name is Buzilă, and I'm happy to be able to present my paper at this conference. My presentation is partly the result of the research I conducted earlier this year as a Fulbright visitor scholar at Rice University. Unfortunately, my stay at Rice coincided with the lockdown period, which was due to the COVID outbreak. So I didn't have a chance to meet too many Rice people. Nevertheless, I did have the opportunity to meet Sydney Lamb in several occasions, who is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics and Cognitive Science at Rice. And he helped me apply this neurocognitive approach to bilingualism, an area which I'm interested in. So this is how I ended up with this presentation, which is a neurocognitive approach to one of the language contact phenomena that can be observed in discourse of bilingual speakers. This is due mainly to my general interest in the brain and in how the mind works. I have a background in linguistics, so by putting together these two areas of interest, I'm now looking at bilingual processing models, and I want to understand how individual linguistic systems process linguistic data. Now, I will make first some clarifications related to some of the terminology in the very title of the presentation. I refer to the choice of semantic borrowing syntag. I will refer briefly to the existing models for bilingual processing. Then I will briefly present the main tenets of the neurocognitive approach. And I will also mention what's the linguistic data I'm using in my analysis. And then I will actually present my analysis. So the first thing to be mentioned is the fact that I use in my paper the term semantic borrowing. And in an earlier version of my presentation, I used semantic calc. Now, traditionally, the phenomena in the question was also referred to as a semantic loans. By reviewing the literature on the topic, I realized that most of the authors prefer semantic borrowing, and this is also the syntagm or the term that is being used in the Romance languages. So we have French, emprunt sémantique, Spanish, préstamo semántico. In my own native language, in Romanian, we say împrumut de sens. It's true that in Romance languages, these terms alternate with those translating to semantic calc. We have calc semantic, calco semantic, and so on. But in general, I think the most widespread terminology would contain semantic borrowing to refer to this phenomena. And the phenomenon in question consists of using a word or a phrase in L1 with a meaning which that word does not actually have in that particular language, but which its counterpart in L2 does have. And this is a definition I compiled from several authors. A typical example given in the literature is the use in American Portuguese of the word humoroso, with the meaning of the American English humorous, although in Portugal it only meant capricious. So we're dealing with the transfer of semantic information from a foreign word to a native one. In what bilingual processing models are concerned, there are several existing models, mainly coming from sociolinguistic and psycholinguistic research. I won't go into too many details now. There are well-known models. What I really realized actually is that these models rely on certain properties, on one or two properties to convey or to have explanatory capabilities. So by looking at different models, I could come up with a list of a short list of the main properties that would grant explanatory capability to a model. And those are stratification, connectivity, and distributed representation of linguistic information. Most of the models rely on one or two of these properties. So my hypothesis is that a model relying on all three and even more properties would arguably have higher explanatory capabilities. And I suggest relational network theory, or the neurocognitive approach, is such a model. What is the neurocognitive approach actually? And that's the third clarification. It is also known relational network theory, and it was mainly developed by Sidney Lamb and some others. It is a model that describes the linguistic system of individuals as a network of relations, and as a system which is interconnected with the rest of the cognitive systems located in the brain. So it is a model that focuses on linguistic system at the individual level and tries to understand linguistic system as a biological system residing in the human brain. Now, I will mention some more details about the model. Before that, the last clarification is related to the linguistic data I'm using. So the data is taken from language context situation taking place within the Romanian immigrant communities in Spain. This is related to the recent history of Romanian immigration to Spain. There are about 1 million Romanians living in Spain now, and they are speaking their native language with an important influence, Spanish influence, to the degree that a new name was coined, Romagnol, to refer to that mixed variety that is being spoken within these communities. This so-called Romagnol has been researched by several authors, and by selecting only those cases of semantic borrowings from all those corpora, I created my own corpus for this analysis. And in that corpus, we can identify 3 types of semantic borrowings, which is in line with what has been identified in the literature so far. So we have meaning-induced semantic borrowings, which rely on common meaning. So for example, the Romanian word or the Romanian verb a rămâne, which means to stay or to remain in one place, has its correspondent, Spanish correspondent, quedar. Now, and so they have this meaning in common, but the Spanish verb quedar also can convey the meaning of to meet or to establish a meeting. Now, using the Romanian verb a rămâne with the meaning of to meet is such a case of meaning-based or meaning-induced borrowing, semantic borrowing. The second type is sound-induced semantic borrowings. So these rely on similar phonetic form. For example, using the Romanian noun turn, which means tower, to convey the meaning that the Spanish translation turno would have, and that is a turn or shift. So like when saying work shift, someone uses the word turnul based on this phonetic similarity with turno in Spanish. And then there's a third type, which is a mixed type. Those cases that rely both on a similar phonetic form and on some common meaning. And I will come back to these examples later. So now, after all these clarifications, I will restate the aim of this presentation is to explain in neurocognitive terms the mechanisms underlying the production of semantic borrowings in the discourse of Romanian Spanish bilingual speakers. Before I actually present my analysis, I will briefly present the main tenets of the neurocognitive approach. So as I said, the model relies on all three basic properties. The model is a stratified one because it makes a distinction between conceptual, lexemic, and phonetic levels, at least between these three levels. It is a model that relies heavily on connectivity because language processing is seen as activation traveling through the network from one node to another via connections. So the model posits this connection as a integral part of the model. And the model also relies on distributed representation of linguistic information. Actually, in this model, linguistic units can be conceived as having both a local representation. We can we can think of them as being one node within the system at a certain location in the system. For example, lexeme take, which would be this node in the central part of this diagram, and a distributed representation. That is, we could think of the lexeme take as having all these distributed representation as being the whole subnetwork composed of all the lines and nodes directly or indirectly connected to this cardinal node. So these properties of the model lead us to this picture where linguistic information is conceived as being a network. Linguistic units have no existence besides their purely relational nature. So the model does not contain any kind of unit or object, only nodes and lines. And linguistic production and perception is seen as activation traveling through the subnetworks according to the types of nodes it crosses. The main distinction is between AND and OR nodes. The AND nodes are represented as a triangle and OR nodes as a horizontal bracket. I forgot to mention the model developed its own notational system in order to represent the relational nature of the system. So the notation is made out of these different types of nodes and lines representing the connections between these nodes. Now, without going into too many details, as the model, although it's not as famous as other models, it is well developed and presented in LAMB and some others. I would just mention that most elements of the model have neural correlates, so there is a high degree of neurological plausibility to this model. Besides those three properties, the model also posits some other properties which are important for understanding how the system works. First of all, the abundance hypothesis states that at any point, nodes in the network have many latent connections to many, although not to all nodes in the neighboring levels. That means that whenever we draw a diagram, we only show the active or strengthened lines and nodes, but we need to remember that at any point there are many other latent connections and nodes which are not represented, and they can be represented once they get strengthened and dedicated. The proximity principle states that a node dedicated to integrate features represented by other nodes will most likely be in an intermediate location to those nodes. And these two properties together lead to a dynamic type of model within which a Hebbian type of learning occurs. That is that as activation takes certain paths repeatedly, certain connections and certain paths will get strengthened and become dedicated. And of course, the opposite is true. Those pathways which don't receive activation will get weaker in time. And there's also bidirectionality to the system. Activation in one direction always trigger feedback activation in the opposite way. And these two together, these four properties together account for a dynamic system within which learning occurs all the time. So a system that is wiring and rewiring its subnetworks all the time. Now, how can we represent distinct languages in this kind of framework? Normally, the switch between languages is posited as a lexical selection task. So then let's see how this kind of task would be represented in a network notation. For example, in figure A, we would represent the selection between the two lexemes man and woman as being performed based on additional activation coming from conceptual nodes. So both lexemes are related, are connected to the concept human, but only one of them will be activated depending on the additional activation coming from male or female. The same kind of reasoning can be used to account for lexical selection based on other type of information. In figure B, we see guy and man, two lexemic nodes, which are connected to the same conceptual nodes, human and male. However, lexical selection will be successfully performed based on additional activation coming from nodes accounting for informal or formal setting. And the same kind of reasoning could be used in the case of lexemes that would belong, let's say, to different languages. So the same speaker would learn to make a distinction between hombre and man, although they are conceptually similar, so they are linked to the same concepts, or the conceptual nodes human and male, but they will receive additional activation coming from that part of the system accounting for the language being spoken, English or Spanish. So in this kind of view, languages within a relational system will actually be implemented as just two different nodes. Now, of course, these different nodes will be activated by a wide array of other nodes accounting for different kind of information. For example, those parts of the system accounting for an English geographical setting or linguistic context, like the previous utterance being in English or question asked in English, and many other parts of the system or many other nodes of the system, any of them or any combination of them being able to activate this node, which then towards the bottom, towards the expression part of the system, would be connected to all those lexemic nodes that we would call English words, so the English lexicon in the system. And the same goes for the Spanish language node. Now, how can this view of the system help us in explaining linguistic semantic borrowings? Now, going back to this phenomena, we have to observe that meaning-induced cases, as we said, rely on common meaning. But we know that common meaning in a monolingual system is usually referred to as synonymy, whereas sound-induced cases rely on similar or even identical phonetic form. Now, this in a monolingual system means homophony. So I'm arguing that linguistic processes accounting for the production of these semantic borrowings in bilingual systems should be similar, if not the same, identical, to those accounting for synonym and homophony in a monolingual system, with the addition of these language nodes. So how would synonymy and homophony be represented in relational diagrams and terms? These are represented simply as different lexemic nodes connected to the same conceptual node. So difficult and hard, for example, in English, both can mean difficult. So it means that these lexemes are connected to the same conceptual node. But in a bilingual system, to the same conceptual node can be linked. The same conceptual node can be linked also to another lexeme, which would be duro, the Spanish word duro. So from a relational, from a neurocognitive point of view, difficult and duro could be seen as just synonyms in the same way that difficult and hard are. So again, I'm not necessarily implying that we should call translational equivalents synonyms, but from a neurocognitive point of view, the mechanisms and the type of wiring that goes on within the system should be the same. And the same goes for homophony. For example, yellow and hello in English are homophones. They have connections to phonetic nodes, so the nodes accounting for the phonetic expression of the phonemes. And with I mean, with the exception of the very first sound, the rest of the nodes are shared by these two, by the representation of these two nodes. And the same goes for the pair yellow and yellow, for example. They share almost all but the last sound. So in the same way in which yellow and hello are homophones, we could say yellow and yellow are also homophones. And again, we don't necessarily need to call them that, but they rely on the same type of mechanisms. So let's see how this can help us explain semantic borrowing. So this is the first case I mentioned earlier, the use of the Romanian verb a rămâne with the meaning of to meet, although it does not have this meaning in Romanian, but its Spanish counterpart, quedar, does have. So how does this happen? First, let's see how a relational relational account would represent, let's say, a clear-cut system where the three lexemes involved are correctly produced each time. So, for example, whenever the concept to remain, to stay in one place would be active, this concept will activate these pathways going towards a rămâne and quedar, Romanian and Spanish. Now, only one of these two lexemes will be produced depending on the additional activation that these end nodes require, coming from those parts of the system accounting for Spanish or Romanian. So, depending on which of these two nodes, language nodes, are active, only one of these two lexemes will be successfully produced. Now, and the same when the meet concept will be active, then these two paths would be active. So activation of only one of these lexemes will also be based on additional activation coming from the language nodes. Now, what happens in time actually will be the following. We have to observe that this central node, accounting for the polysemy of quedar, will become a very strong node because it will receive activation in many more occasions. That is, in both cases when remain and meet are active. So this central part of the subnetwork would become stronger than the other parts. The second thing that happens is that this part of the system, will be active, these nodes will be active in many occasions in which this node for the production of the lexeme a rămâne will be active. And that's why, because they are both connected to the conceptual node remain. Well, what this means in a relational system that allows for Hebbian learning is that because these two nodes are consistently being active at the same time, and according to the famous formulation of the Hebbian principle, nodes that fire together will wire together, in time there will be a connection being built between these two nodes. Now, this is one way of saying it. Actually, what happens is that the already existing latent connections between these two nodes will get strengthened in time and will get dedicated to processing this information that is a conceptual node meet expressed as the lexical node a rămâne. Now, of course, this creates another synonymous situation between a rămâne and a se întâlni, but this will be most of the time resolved via other kind of mechanisms, and I won't go into detail right now. The thing is that this relational architecture of the system naturally explains how this type of connection will be built, will get strengthened in time. And that's how we get the production of the lexeme a rămâne with the meaning meet, although it did not have that in Romanian before the contact with Spanish. A similar explanation goes for sound-induced semantic borrowings with the small differences. So, for example, to explain how the lexeme, Romanian lexeme turn is used to convey the meaning turn or shift, although in Romanian it only has the meaning tower, as we can see in this diagram. We rely on their phonetic representation. So both lexemes turn in Romanian and turno in Spanish, with two different meanings, they share most of the nodes for their phonetic expression. Now, based on the bidirectionality of the system, we know that when these nodes for the phonetic expression are active, they will send feedback activation upwards. So whenever one of these two lexemes is active, it will actually slightly activate the other via feedback. And this feedback will reach the top of hierarchy to the conceptual level. So that means that in time, whenever one of these lexemes is produced, the other will get some activation via feedback, and the meaning related to the other will also get some activation. So in time, we will have some occasions in which turn, for example, is slightly activated whenever turn as a lexeme is activated. So between these two parts of the system, necessarily a connection already existing, a latent connection, will be strengthened. So we will get a system where now the concept turn or shift is connected to the lexeme tur, and will lead to the production in several occasions of this lexeme instead of the Spanish one or the Romanian correct one. Now, the third type would be explained in the same way. This time, the mechanism, both mechanisms explained earlier, will be active. So I won't insist, as my time is kind of expiring. So I will just skip to the conclusions and say that the RNT model can successfully represent semantic borrowings in relational terms. When doing that, we can see that meaning-induced cases rely on the same type of subnetworks that account for synonymy, that is shared parts of the subnetworks at the semantic level, whereas sound-induced cases rely on the same type of subnetworks that account for homophony, that is shared part of the network at the phonetic level. And mixed types are situations in which the two types mechanisms reinforce each other. And all these cases are possibly to the Hebbian type of learning, which is embedded in the model. Now, as a further development, I suggest we should apply this model to other types of language context phenomena, like loan words, like syntacticals, and so on, to see if this model can really explain all these types of language context phenomena, and if the model can really be seen as a strong model that can explain bilingual data. I will just mention briefly that all the diagrams were produced by using Gordon Tisha's Neurolab tool, which is available on the web. And with that, I thank you very much.